Dean, I was trained in the sciences, and I've had this deep longing in my life to want to know the nature of reality, and whether explored theologically or philosophically, I have this passion to know. Now, I've heard about this concept called possible worlds that philosophers use to discern really interesting questions. How does that work?
Well, possible worlds are a tool for thinking about how things might have been and how things perhaps had to be. When you talk about, these notions are, generally come under the heading of modality. So modal notions are notions that have to do with could have beens, might have beens, would have beens. And when you suppose that something could have been different, what you're imagining is a world with things a little bit different, right? So if I'm wondering if I could have been sitting there and you sitting here, I'm wondering if there's a possibility of things having been a different way, with us reversed. Now, if I had been sitting there and you had been sitting here, everything else would have been a certain way as well. I mean, there's a lot of different ways for us to have been switched. Each of those is just a precise way that the world could have been in its entirety. In general, then, worlds just are ways that everything could have been.
So we're defining literally everything that exists. Even if there's one small difference, that's a different possible world. So there's obviously an infinite number of possible worlds.
Right, right. So, I mean, in the ordinary course of life, we're interested in just little differences, the differences in little chunks of worlds. But clearly, the whole world is one particular way, and so there, for other ways that little parts of it could be, there are many ways of completing.
Okay, so we understand what a possible world is. Now, you said it's a tool. So it's a tool to explore what kinds of questions?
Questions about necessity and possibility and contingency. So you can ask questions like, did the universe have to exist? Is it a necessary thing? Well, you just translate that into the possible worlds talk. It's a way of asking, is every possible world something that contains this universe? On the other hand, if there's some ways that things could have been that don't include it, well, then it's a merely contingent thing.
So you are, in a sense, defining this crucial difference between necessity, something that has to be no matter what, and contingent, meaning it could have been otherwise, using the possible worlds tool to say a necessary thing has to exist in every conceivable possible world, whereas if it exists in every conceivable possible world except one, then it's not necessary, it's a contingent. Is that right?
Right, although there's an equivalence, and whether it's a definition is a matter of a lot of debate. So should you try to define a notion like necessarily exists in terms of possible worlds?
Yeah.
Or should you take it that necessarily blah, blah, blah is the fundamental idea, and possible worlds are something that you can define in terms of that? So a lot of people think that the locution, the phrase necessarily blah 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 is the most basic idea here, and from it you get maybe equally basic is the notion of possibility, possibly blah blah blah, and then you can just define the notion of a possible world as a kind of a biggest sentence or proposition that's still possible, that includes yes or no answers to all the propositions that there are.
Now, trying to discern what it's all about, obviously we always are interested in, does God exist? And And I guess to think about it in using this tool, we can think about, does God exist, if God exists, in every possible world? Because then that would make God necessary, which a lot of people, theologians, think God is necessary. But I can think of many possible worlds in which God doesn't exist. But just because I can think about it, does that mean that those possible worlds do exist?
Right. So this tool of possible worlds, it really doesn't seem to answer questions like that. So you say, I can easily imagine a world without this kind of being. Doesn't that show that there is such a world? Well, just from our definition of what possible worlds are, that doesn't help us, really. The question is one of epistemology. It's a question that belongs partly in the theory of knowledge. How is it that we can understand things and have knowledge about necessary truths, possibilities, things of that sort? How can we latch on to those things? I mean, it's kind of mysterious in a way, because the realm of possibilities is a realm of things that, in some sense, aren't, right? The mere possibilities.
Sure.
So how am I able to track facts about those things using my mind, which is very much, part of the concrete world? And I think we've got to put it in the same category with, say, mathematics. How is it that I can track things about this necessary world of numbers and their interrelations when they're not really numerical facts aren't out there to be discovered empirically? And then the question is, does that intuition that you've got, I can imagine a world without such a being, is that good evidence that there really is such a being?
Because I can't imagine a world without the number 2.
Right.
I can't.
Right.
Now, is that distinction important? I cannot imagine a world without the number 2, but I can imagine a world without God.
I think it is important, because I don't see where else we're going to get a grip on what the possible worlds are like, what the possibilities are, and what necessities there are, if we're not getting at it somehow through our ability to conceive of this rather than that. If the way things seem to us, what seems possible to us, if that's just no guide whatsoever to what's possible and what's necessary, then I don't see how, we just have to be total skeptics about this.